The central question I find myself asking is who can lead us to freedom? I've been being quiet for a little while, in part because I have been writing and channeling most of my creative energy toward that end, in part to create some space for other voices, but in large part because people who talk without first educating themselves tend to make matters much worse. And I'm noticing that given the platform that social media gives to anyone with a device, a lot of people have been talking without thinking first. And I don't think that's helping. That has led me to ask the question, what could help? What could move things toward a more beautiful future? And as I think about that, I'm finding that the contribution I want to make is basically to entertain three questions. What are the conversations that need to happen in order to move forward together? It's question number one. The second question is, who are the kinds of people who could constructively have those conversations? Because not everyone can. And then the third question, of course, would be, how do we become that kind of person? And how do we cultivate that kind of person? And that's what we're gonna talk about today. I grew up south of Detroit in a family that was pretty politically active. And as a child and as a teenager, I had the benefit of participating in public demonstrations regarding things that we cared very deeply about. Recently, my family lived for 8 years in Central Asia. In the city that we lived in, there were certain people that you were not allowed to talk about. And if you talked about them, you were only allowed to say certain kinds of things about them. When there was a demonstration, you could count on it that the vast majority of the demonstrators would disappear. They would simply not be there anymore. And some of them we would never hear from again. So as I watch the news and see my home country kind of ripping itself apart, and it's been doing this for a long time, not just around issues of race. It's been carefully, intentionally being polarized by certain voices on two sides of a conversation that really isn't two-sided. I find myself very grateful to be from a country and to be a citizen of a country where you can demonstrate. So I'm very grateful for demonstration. At some point, though, we're going to have to move from demonstration to conversation. And not every conversation is constructive. I find myself reflecting, like, what are the common characteristics of constructive conversations? In a constructive conversation, the participants are informed. They have looked at data. They haven't just listened to what pundits from a side or another side or a third side. They haven't just listened to media. They haven't just consumed media. They have researched for truth. So a good conversation involves people who are informed. It also involves people who are present. There are no constructive conversations about important topics that can take place over social media. And that sort of makes me wish that people would be quiet on social media so that actual conversations could happen. If you've ever tried to have a meaningful conversation in a room full of other people who are yelling, you know how aggravating it is to try to actually get a good conversation done. It's very hard to think your own thoughts and to be heard or to hear, more importantly, to hear, when everybody is talking. A good conversation has participants who are informed but also physically present to one another in some meaningful way. In a good conversation, no one's yelling. People have the emotional intelligence to be able to contain themselves and to present their thoughts or to present their feelings in a constructive way. There's no yelling, but there is a lot of listening. In a good conversation, people are listening to understand, not to win. They're trying to truly understand and perceive the other person's point of view, not to deflect or defeat them, but in order to find a path forward, to discover a path forward together. So any constructive conversation has at least those things in common. But the kinds of conversations that need to happen right now in the United States have some other things in common as well. These conversations are going to involve history, and in particular, different approaches to history. There's going to be the facts of history themselves, like the dates things happened, and the people who were involved in those things, and some of the events that led up to those things, and some of the events that came after those things. There's going to have to be attention to cause and effect. So that's a matter of facts. There's also the matter of perspective on history. As someone who's lived in and participated in multiple cultures, I can tell you that different peoples view different events in very different ways. And everyone's a little bit wrong and could afford to listen to each other when that happens. There's not only the different perspectives on the history, there's also different experiences of the events in history. We experience what happened differently, whether it happened to us or it happened to the group that we are a part of. So there's the facts, there's the perspectives, there's the experiences, but then there's also the recitation of history. I heard a brilliant young man comment on this once. His name was Coleman Hughes. He talked about how an atheist historian will learn about the events of the life of Jesus differently to how a Christian who goes to church every Sunday will learn about the events of the life of Jesus. These two historical inquiries might actually have the same facts in them, but the Christian is repeating the facts every Sunday on purpose. They are reciting history in order to give the history opportunity to shape their identity. The history involved in these conversations isn't only being studied, it is also being recited, and that has an effect on the conversation. All right, so the conversations will contain history. They will also contain facts and feelings. Each of these are valid. If you have a conversation with someone, you're having a conversation with a human being, and human beings, by nature, have feelings, and our emotions inform the way we interpret reality. That doesn't mean that feelings are facts. That doesn't mean that something is offensive because I was offended. But if you don't take into account the fact I was offended, you've stopped having a conversation with me, and now you're just having a conversation with the data, and we cannot move forward. So a constructive conversation is going to take into account facts and feelings. It will also hold in account the fact that facts are not feelings and feelings are not facts. These are not the same thing. They have different roles to play in the acquisition of wisdom and in reasonable discourse. So these conversations will also refer to individual and collective experience. Cultures fall along multiple continua, and one of the continua is the individualism-collectivism continuum. In some cultures, the individual is more important, and in other cultures, the group is more important. In an individualistic culture, what happens to me is what I experience as having happened to me. In a collectivist culture, what happens to any of us feels like it happened to me. In the country we lived in last, on the government webpage for a long time, they had a tab called Blood Memory. There are holidays in which they remember atrocities that happened to them, specifically atrocities that were perpetrated by a neighboring country whom they all hate, and they take it as their personal duty to hate that other culture. That culture remembers different holidays as blood memory, things that happened 100 years ago that did not happen to anybody alive right now, and they remember that as having happened to them, and they take it as their personal responsibility to hate their neighboring culture. As an American from the United States, that was very difficult to understand for a while, until we lived there for a while and had kind of begun to adopt a more collectivist view of humanity. Saying to someone from that Central Asian country that those atrocities didn't happen to you, they didn't actually happen to you, was akin to saying to us, if someone broke into our home and stole our things, saying to us, well, this didn't happen to you because it didn't happen to your body, it only happened to your things. The edge of what I consider to be me includes what I own as an American. The edge of what my Central Asian friends viewed to be them included all of them. When someone from an individualistic cultural background is having a conversation with someone from a more collectivistic cultural background, the individualist needs to understand why someone might be saying some of the things they're saying. The individualist also needs to doubt their own narrative. Similarly, someone from a collectivist background would need to have the courage to also doubt their own narrative. A lack of awareness about how culture works can make a cross-cultural conversation extremely difficult. And therefore, any conversation that crosses a cultural line requires careful listening for understanding and vigorous inquiry. For vigorous inquiry to take place, people have to have the courage to ask difficult questions, as well as the courage that it takes to have difficult questions asked of them, the generosity of spirit necessary to continue believing the best about the other person, even if they ask a challenging question. So you can see these are twisty, difficult conversations, and not everybody can have them. So what kinds of people can contribute to these essential conversations constructively? These people are going to have to be able to speak as a member of a community without necessarily speaking for that community. That's going to require considerable experience, as well as a habit of careful reflection on experience, combined with considerable self-awareness. Secondly, these people are probably going to need very high cultural intelligence. Cultural intelligence, or CQ, is a capacity, it's a form of intelligence that can be developed. It comprises your motivation to cross cultures, your knowledge about how other cultures work, your ability to deploy strategies that would change the way you behave when you were around people from another culture, and the gumption to act differently. Cultural intelligence is not necessarily higher in a minority population or in a majority population. It seems to be specific to individuals. If you want to learn more about that, check out the Cultural Intelligence Center. These people are going to need a strong proclivity to listen to understand, obviously not to listen to win. That's probably going to mean that strong political affiliations are more of a liability than they are an asset. We really limit generous, curious discovery, humble learning, when we feel responsible to push a particular narrative. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, these people are going to have to be hard to trigger, but able to empathize. That's tricky, because the kinds of things that make you able to empathize are usually very, very difficult, painful things. Normally, you've kind of been through the ringer. You have suffered something acute, and that makes you able to empathize. However, when we suffer something acute, we can become easy to trigger. If you're not familiar with that term, I have here the definition of trigger. A trigger in psychology is a stimulus such as a smell, a sound, or a sight that triggers feelings of trauma. People typically use this term when describing PTSD. In the modern North American university setting, this term has been sort of pop psychologized to mean anytime someone says something that I might possibly find offensive, I have the right to say that they should not have said that. If I find that something bothers my sensibilities in any way, I may say that I was triggered. As a result, many universities, places where people are doing careful thinking, are working to create safe spaces. I really like when people don't feel alarmed. I like creating safe space, but this term has actually come to mean something very specific. The term safe space refers to places created for individuals who feel marginalized to come together to communicate regarding their experiences with marginalization. Most commonly located on university campuses in the Western world, but also at workplaces in a few cases. In the modern academic conversation, people are often unable to participate in meaningful dialogue because they have been triggered and therefore have to retreat to a safe space. This is extremely unhelpful when anything important is going to be discussed. If something is important, I'm probably going to have strong feelings about it, and so are you. And you're probably going to say something that bothers me. If I can't move forward in the conversation because this bothered me so deeply that it's turned off my ability to think, we can't have a conversation, certainly not a constructive one. The safe space culture in the modern university setting has made it very difficult to responsibly process trauma, to become the kind of person who after trauma, who after a very difficult, truly, genuinely awful thing has happened to you, you are stronger for it and not diminished, crippled, or rendered unable to participate in meaningful discourse. So the people who can have these very difficult conversations are going to be people who have suffered and who have processed their suffering well, so that they are stronger for it, more supple for it, more flexible for it, and not diminished to the point where any potentially offensive conversation is going to reduce the conversation to argument or paralysis. So finally, how do we become and cultivate these kinds of people who can have these kinds of constructive conversations to move us forward into a future that's better than the present? First, we can get informed, and we can make sure we're being informed by people who we don't necessarily already agree with. This probably will mean moving away from news outlets toward direct sources of data, becoming people who, can we even imagine it, read. Secondly, we can grow our cultural intelligence. We can grow our CQ. There are ways to do that, and I might talk about that in a future video. Finally, we can eschew staying safe for becoming strong. We can get help where we're wounded. We can do the hard work, see a counselor, and we can create growth spaces. It is impossible to child-proof the world. Instead, let's try to create adults. In the comments below, let me know which part of this conversation was most challenging for you, or which part of the conversation would you like to see pursued more thoroughly. In our next video, we might talk about what role the church could play in healing a fractured and broken nation.